I'd like to welcome you all to our third talk in our series of programs, looking forward to the 300th by looking back at Nottingham's history. And this is just a sampling of one of our great quality events that we have planning for 2021. And we hope that you will support our celebration by supporting Article 17, which will be on our town warrant that you'll vote on in June. And like I said, we will have the merchandise at a pop-up store coming soon to you. From what I read, and Emma, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Nottingham contributed more officers to the American Revolution than any other town of its size in New Hampshire, its size being less than 1,000 people at that time. And so tonight's talk is going to focus on two of them, General Joseph Cilley and General Henry Dearborn, and our speaker is Emma Stratton, who is the executive director of the American Independence Museum. And just a reminder, you are on mute, but if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and we will get to it at the end of the program. And this is being recorded, so if you want to tell your friends about it, it will be up on YouTube and we will publicize that once it's up there. Okay, thank you, Emma.
Great, thank you, Rhoda. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Nottingham Historical Society and the 300th Anniversary Committee. We are, it's an honor to be with you all tonight, and we are celebrating some anniversaries at the American Independence Museum too. This year is actually the 300th anniversary of our Lad Gilman House, having been built in 1721, and the 30th anniversary of our museum. So I feel like we're just in a very celebratory mood, especially as we're starting to come out of this pandemic. So I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight. And I am going to be talking about, as Rhoda mentioned, the generals, Joseph Cilley and Henry Dearborn, and specifically their connection to the Society of the Cincinnati, which plays into our museum as our parent organization. So I am going to talk a little bit about our museum, then get into who the society is, what they're all about, then talk about Cilley and Dearborn, and then kind of loop back to the society today and our museum today. And as Rhoda mentioned, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So I will start by introducing you all to our museum in Exeter, New Hampshire, which I hope some of you have been to. We have a large American Independence Festival every year in July that we host with reenactors and artisans. It's a wonderful event that we have. And so maybe you've come to that or come for a tour. This is one of our two buildings. This is the Lad Gilman House, celebrating its 300th anniversary this year. And we are excited to be hosting those events. Inside our museum, we have about 3,000 objects, mostly related to the Revolutionary War. And our museum is really focused on telling the unique stories of local people, places, and events of the Revolutionary era. So we have a particular focus and interest in what happened in New Hampshire, and certainly with Exeter serving as the capital during the Revolutionary War, we have a lot of those wonderful stories to tell. So here's the sign that's outside our Lad Gilman House, that it was built in 1721 as one of New Hampshire's earliest brick houses, and enlarged and clapboarded in the 1750s. The dwelling served as the state treasury during the Revolution. And here was born John Taylor Gilman, who was elected governor for an unequaled total of 14 years, and his brother Nicholas Gilman Jr., a signer of the US Constitution. The house has been maintained since 1902 by the Society of the Cincinnati. This is the other building on our property. This is Folsom Tavern. It was built in 1775. And for those of you familiar with downtown Exeter, the original location of this is actually by the bandstand where Me and Ollie's is today. And it was moved to our site originally in 1929 by the Society, and then fully restored and renovated and moved to its current position from 2004 to 2007. And one of our claims to fame here is the tavern is that George Washington ate here, and it was his only stop on his visit to Exeter. So we take great pride in saying that George Washington ate here at our tavern. Today, the tavern's primarily used for programming, and as I was mentioning at the beginning of this talk, that this is actually where we're hosting our tours this year. Due to COVID restrictions and social distancing, our tavern is actually the only building currently open to the public. So we've created a whole new tour experience that focuses on the tavern and the tavern experiences of different individuals in the Revolutionary era. So I do hope that you'll come join us starting May 15th for tours of our tavern. But the tavern's other claim to fame, well, I should say, besides being where George Washington ate, is that it was also the location for the founding of the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of New Hampshire in 1783. So that state society are the founders and owners of our museum. So the society defines themselves as the nation's oldest patriotic organization, founded by officers of the Continental Army and their French counterparts who served together during the American Revolution. Their mission is to promote knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence and to foster fellowship amongst its members. The National Society then has those 14 constituent societies, one for each of the original colonies and one for France, since they were our allies during the war. So here is President George Washington, but you'll see this is a portrait that's actually in our collection, done after one by Gilbert Stuart. There is an insignia that he is wearing, a medal on his lapel. That is the society insignia. So that's the Society of the Cincinnati Eagle, because George Washington serves also as the first President General of the Society of the Cincinnati. Now, we always get this question at the museum. So what does the society have to do with Ohio? And it's a great question, but it actually goes back a lot further than Ohio's history, back to a Roman general. So this is where the root of the name Cincinnati comes from. It's actually from Lucius Cincinnatus. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his story and how the Cincinnati got their name. So as I mentioned, it's named for this ancient Roman hero, Lucius Cincinnatus, and he is called on by the Roman Senate to lead the army of the Republic, and they've granted him these powers to deal with the crisis thus facing Rome. After leading the army to victory, he resigns his commission, returns power to the Senate, and retires to his farm, refusing any reward for his service to the Republic. So he's this embodiment of civic virtue, willing to sacrifice private interest and private gain for the good of the public. Does that sound like anyone we know who's been called on to serve his country and then retires to his farm and then only to be called back later to serve again? Why, George Washington, of course. So this is really who all of the officers and the members of the society want to emulate themselves after, is Cincinnatus. They believe that the characteristics that he embodies, humility, personal sacrifice, commitment to public welfare, and the subordination of military to civilian rule, are essential to the survival of a Republican government. They're really basing themselves on these ideals. And Cincinnati, of course, comes from the plural of Cincinnatus. So this is really where they get the ideas of their organization from. And there is a connection to Ohio that I do like to point out, and that Cincinnati, Ohio, what did take its name from Cincinnatus and the society. In 1790, Arthur St. Clair is the governor of the Northwest Territory, which is now Ohio. And he was the president of the State Society of Pennsylvania and gave the town its name. So there's a nice connection there that you may not have known about. So as the society is forming from these officers, they're coming up with ways to really distinguish themselves, not only in their characteristics and their virtues, but also in how they will show or represent themselves. So these again are two objects in our collection. This is the Society Eagle, both a watercolor from L'Enfant, Pierre L'Enfant on the left, and a medal that is later what was reproduced and is still reproduced today on the right. So the idea was they wanted to have a badge that they could wear to show that they had served during the war, and also to pass down in their family. So this idea of showing their service was really important to them. And the image that's in the center of that eagle is an image of Cincinnatus that you see depicted. Now, who is one of the great founders, or the original kind of the chief author, as he described, of the Cincinnati? That's Henry Knox. So it's really his ideas that come to fruition through the society. And Henry Knox, of course, being known for taking the cannons from Ticonderoga to Boston. He is later becomes Secretary of War, very close with George Washington. And it's really him and Washington that come up with this idea of the society. And he's, as it mentions, the chief author of what's called the Institution, which is the founding document for the society. So this outlines what their purpose is as an organization. So we know what their virtues are, they've got their medal, but what are they going to do? And so this is what they come up with. They want to perpetuate the memory of the War for Independence. They want to maintain the fraternal bonds between officers, promote the ideals of the Revolution, and then support members and their families in need, distinguish their members as men of honor, and advocate for the compensation promised to the officers by Congress, which is also a really important part that I'll talk about in a little bit too. What is interesting is there are limits on this membership. So they decide that it will only be open to men who served as officers for 3 years in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. So this meant it would exclude all men who did not achieve an officer rank, and it would exclude all of those who served in the militia, which is why tonight I'm not talking about Thomas Butler and Henry Bartlett, because they were not eligible for membership in the society because they served in the militias, not in the army. So there's a distinction there between the different types of service. And also they come up with the idea that membership in the society is going to be passed through the eldest son, which is a concept called primogeniture. So of the original members, the membership would then pass to the eldest son, and then to his eldest son, and then to his eldest son. And I'll talk a little bit about why that creates a problem later on. As I mentioned, advocacy was a big part of their early work in the society. So here we have a number of different bills and receipts in our collection that are written to widows of New Hampshire men who served in the war. So they are consistently taking up funds to be able to support these men's families after the war. And they are also advocating with Congress for back pay for the soldiers as well. And what I think is interesting is not only are they advocating for pay for fellow society members, they're also advocating for back pay for any member who served in the military, who may not be a member of society. They were still helping to advocate with Congress to get them paid. So that's really interesting to see all the advocacy they were involved with to begin. Now, with any society that forms that has a kind of exclusive membership list, you're going to get people that are for it and against it. So I have highlighted some of the individuals we may know who are for and against the society. So in the for column, starting at the top left and going clockwise, we have Alexander Hamilton, who would later succeed George Washington as President General of the Society. Then we have Pierre L'Enfant, who is the one who designed the medal that we then see. In the bottom right with the AIM designation under it is John Sullivan. He would actually go on to be the first president of the New Hampshire Society. And then we also have Benjamin Lincoln, who's the first president of the Massachusetts Society. So in the against column, we have a few people as well, because the main criticism of a lot of these groups was that they felt the society was trying to impose a hereditary aristocracy on the new republic. And what does that sound like? That sounds like England. That's what we just won the war against. We're trying to fight off these ideas of aristocracy and things that are passed down by birth. That's not an ideal of our country. So there are a lot that really feel like it's a threat to our liberty and to the new nation. So John Adams actually is quoted as saying, the first step taken to deface the beauty of our temple of liberty. That's what he has to say about the society. Thomas Jefferson is against it as well as in the top right corner there is John Stark from New Hampshire. For those of you who may know a little bit about him, it's probably not surprising that he's against the idea of the society, but famously does not join and does not become a member of the society when they first organized in 1783. So not without its kind of controversy during those days. But they do still form in New Hampshire, and they're organized first by Knox and Washington in New Windsor, New York in June of 1783. And by November, they're gathering at Folsom Tavern in Exeter. So you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a detail of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment flag. And on the right-hand side is the actual kind of advertisement that John Sullivan posts in the New Hampshire Gazette in September, telling people that they're going to gather at Folsom Tavern in November. And it's in here, and I will read this to you as best I can with the old script there, because I think it gives you an idea of what we've talked about, who's eligible for membership and this idea of gathering a fraternal organization. So it reads, the plan for forming the Society of the Cincinnati, together with the emblems of the order and the several revolutions past relative thereto, having been transmitted to me by His Excellency the President of the Society, with directions to take the proper steps for establishing a state society in New Hampshire. In obedience to the instructions received, I take the liberty of requesting all officers who have served 3 years as such in the New Hampshire line, and others residing in this state who have served as officers in the American Army 3 years in the present war, as well as those who have been deranged or resigned with honor, as those who are in actual service, to meet me at the house of Colonel Samuel Folsom in Exeter on Tuesday, the 18th day of November next, at 10 of the clock in the forenoon, to choose a state president and all other proper officers of the society, and to agree upon the necessary measures for complying with the regulations established by the society at their general meeting. And that's written by John Sullivan, who is later goes on to be elected as the first president, which I always think, if you're the one who wants to organize it, you better be ready to lead it. So that's certainly what happens with him. And this is a detail from another object in our collection, which is actually the original membership book of the New Hampshire Society. So these are the signatures of the men who were present that day in November. And I will point out to you, these pages do not have Dearborn or Joseph Cilley's signature, but you do see Jonathan Cilley's signature. Again, Jonathan Cilley is Joseph Cilley's son. He also served in the Revolutionary War and attained the rank of an officer. And because of that, he was also eligible for membership. So you'll see his signature is in the left-hand column, the 4th from the top. But here are all the men who are original members. There are 31 who originally joined the New Hampshire Society when they organized in Exeter on that day in November. And so the society in their first decade was a real period of energy and growth. Over 2,200 officers joined the organization across all the state societies. And these state societies typically met annually around the 4th of July. They would have banquets, formal addresses, processions, and other ceremonies. The society met annually until 1824, the New Hampshire Society in particular, at taverns in Exeter, Epsom, Epping, Durham, Nottingham, Deerfield, and Portsmouth. So they moved around in terms of where they met. And although there were more than 200 officers eligible for membership, it was only those 31 that finally signed the institution. And the activities of the society appear mostly to have been to dine together annually on the 4th of July, to elect their officers, and to distribute the income from their permanent fund among the widows and children of their members. The seldom were more than 5 to 8 members in attendance after the first decade, but the collations, that's the meals, were sumptuous. And I like this line, the collations were both sumptuous and ample, as witnessed by the tavern bills preserved in the society's archives. So again, they knew how to celebrate and have a good party. But membership numbers had decreased by such a point that in 1826, they'd basically just become extinct because of the death of all their members. So again, if you think of this idea of primogeniture, passing on the membership to the eldest son, Well, what if you don't have a son? Then your membership line dies out. So they get to a point where there are just no members left, and it's not until 1893 that they are revived by 7 members, including Bradbury Longfellow Cilley and Joseph Neely Cilley. So 2 Cilley members are involved in the revival of it since 1893. Since then, they have been active and still remain active, and I believe now they have just over 200 members in the Society for New Hampshire. So still an active group. As part of your society membership as well, you would get this certificate. And this is actual Daniel Gookin's certificate. It's one of the originals in our collection. Unfortunately, we don't have Cilley or Dearborn's, but we have Gookin's. And this is a certificate they all still get to this day. It's printed in black and white. You have the Society Eagle at the top. At the bottom left, you have a soldier who represents Cincinnatus, defying Britannia, who represents England. You have a maritime scene at the bottom, and then an angel on a cloud heralding victory in the right-hand corner. So again, another part of the society membership is this certificate. So I'm now going to turn to our 2 gentlemen of the hour. So I'm first going to talk about Joseph Cilley. Again, he was an original member of the society, and I have both his birth dates at the top, 1732 to 1799, and the dates he was active with the society, which is 1783 through his death. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of his military history and what he did, but what I'm going to focus a little bit more on is his role in different activities that happened in New Hampshire, because I grew up in Massachusetts, and I feel like Massachusetts always takes all the credit for all these Revolutionary War battles, because we didn't have them in New Hampshire. Some really interesting things still happened here that I want to talk about. So Joseph Cilley is born in Nottingham, and before the war is a farmer, a self-taught lawyer, and a businessman. And after the war, after being a soldier, becomes a judge and a politician. And his father had come from the Isle of Shoals. He first joins Roger's Rangers in 1758, and then he's at the raid on Fort William and Mary in December of 1774. He marches to Lexington, which, as Rhoda and I were talking about at the beginning of this, Patriots' Day was just yesterday, so I feel like the timing of this presentation is perfect. He joined the 2nd New Hampshire and then the 1st New Hampshire. He's serving in Canada. He's in Trenton, Princeton. He's all over the place during the Revolutionary War. And in 1779, under Washington's orders, he joins the Sullivan-Clinton expedition against the Loyalists and Iroquois out in Western New York. After the war, he's named the head of the New Hampshire militia. He serves as a state senator. And one of the interesting facts I learned too is he had a son who was born after the war. His youngest son was named Horatio Gates Cilley. So they must have been friends in the battle as well to name his son after him. They were both at Saratoga together. And his line, the Joseph Cilley line, is still represented in the New Hampshire Society today, which is interesting as well. As I mentioned, his son Jonathan Cilley also served in the Revolutionary War and was an original member of the New Hampshire Society. Joseph Cilley himself serves as treasurer, vice president, and later president of the society, the New Hampshire Society. So I'm first going to talk about his role in Fort William and Mary in Newcastle. And talking about, I really enjoy talking about Fort William and Mary because it's just such it's a wonderful story that I feel like a lot of people don't know too much about. And obviously coming on the tales of Patriots' Day and Paul Revere's famous ride, we also have Fort William and Mary being Paul Revere's less famous ride or lesser known ride. And this, of course, one could make the argument that really the Revolutionary War started in New Hampshire, since our activities at Fort William and Mary predate Lexington and Concord by about 4 months, I should say, since Fort William and Mary, the storming of that happened in December of 1774. And Paul Revere rides up from Boston with news that the British are coming to reinforce the fort at William and Mary, which is in Newcastle. It is now called Fort Constitution. And as he rides up, Paul Revere notifies all of the different towns along the way. They gather together their men and they meet at the local tavern in Portsmouth. And they decide, led by John Sullivan, that they are going to storm the fort. And I always think this is a really interesting story as well, because it all ends up being fake news in the end. It all ends up being false information. Paul Revere has been given bad information that the British are coming to reinforce the fort. They are not in fact coming, but tensions are so high at that time that there's so much almost paranoia about what could happen or what is going to happen, that he races up to tell them all they're reinforcing the fort. That must mean they're, about to increase hostility. So 200 men go and march on Fort William and Mary, only to find about 5 or 6 soldiers there. And so when they show up, they say there's kind of this back and forth between Sullivan and the leader, and they end up taking all the gunpowder from the fort. And that gunpowder goes by gundelow out to the various towns. So a lot of it comes to Exeter, to our powder house. It goes to Portsmouth. It goes to all the different areas. And that powder is later used by our men when they go fight the British at Bunker Hill and at the battles in Massachusetts. So that gunpowder is then used against the British. But after they take the gunpowder, they actually go back the next day and then take all the armaments from the British. So they're taking the cannons and the guns and the rifles and things like that. And Cilley is part of that. He's part of the group of men that come up as with Paul Revere's ride and storm the fort. I say storm the fort. I don't really think they stormed it when it's so outnumbered in that sense, but they go and they take those, all of the supplies that are there. So it's really this first act of aggression, one could say, in the Revolutionary War that happens in Newcastle that Cilley is a part of. So a precursor of what's to come with the later war, but I think it's a great story about New Hampshire, and certainly Fort Constitution is still there, not as it's depicted above. That's an image from our collection of how it did appear in the colonial time, but there is a plaque down below that notes the events that happened there. And there are plans, as we're looking ahead to 2024, for the 250th anniversary of that. And there are groups that are already in talks about how to do a kind of reenactment of that event to bring it to the fort, which I think will be wonderful. And then the other event I want to talk about with Cilley is the paper money riot in Exeter. And I wanted to talk about this because it has to do with Exeter. And it's also something that happens after the Revolution that I think is really interesting and part of kind of larger rebellions that are happening in the country at that time. So after the Revolution, our country is heavily in debt. And before we have our Constitution drafted, we're governed by the Articles of Confederation, which give a lot of power to the individual states and not much power to the central government. So paper currency is required by tax collectors to pay off debts, but it's really hard to come by. Again, you don't have a central kind of mint that we do now, a central currency. And you'll see that one of the images from our collection is a dollar bill from the state of New Hampshire. So this meant if you were traveling from New Hampshire to Massachusetts, you'd have to go to the state treasury, which was located at our museum, and you'd have to exchange your New Hampshire dollar for a Massachusetts dollar. And so it didn't really help in terms of controlling the economy, especially after the war. So by the mid-1780s, riots and protests are on the rise across the states, led by local men, farmers, and war veterans. And a group of New Hampshire men, calling themselves the Regulators, demand an increase in the amount of paper money minted to help stimulate the economy and allow people to pay off their debts. So on September 20th of 1786, frustrated by the lack of response from local legislatures, they gather in Kingston and march on Exeter. Armed with muskets, they surround the general court. A disgruntled crowd of Exeter locals gather to watch the spectacle become a mob. They hold the legislators captive in the meeting house until their demands are met. John Sullivan comes out and hears the complaints from the leaders. but is unable to move the legislators to make any action as the day comes to an end. So Colonel Nathaniel Gilman devises a ruse to disperse the mob. With a few men and a drummer boy, he starts shouting, "Hurrah for government, here comes Hackett's artillery." The artillery's not coming. He just makes them think they are. So they all flee and disperse, and they reorganize by Little River, which is what is pictured in the larger image here, where they stay the night. So the legislature knew they had to act because there were similar rebellions that happened in Keene in 1782, and of course Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786 as well. So Sullivan requests nearby officers and their militia to come to Exeter the next morning, and he leads 2,000 men to Little River, where Joseph Cilley and several others are on horseback and initiated a surprise attack on the men, who then flee, but they're able to capture most of the mob's ringleaders as a part of this. So the ringleaders are tried but pardoned by Sullivan, and the legislature puts forth a bill to be voted on by each town to increase the printing of paper money as an appeasement to the public. However, in the end, there's a report written by the Treasury, which includes the Gilmans, that says that would actually be detrimental. And in the end, the paper money riot is unsuccessful. They don't increase currency, and it's not until we get the Constitution that a uniform and reliable stream of currency is created. But I think that story is so interesting because we have these men that serve in the Revolutionary War that are fighting for these ideals of liberty and independence. And then when there are these protests by other people after the war, kind of within our own towns and our own areas, Cilley is on the part of the militia of dispersing and putting down those kind of uprisings that happen in the area. So I think that's really an interesting story, and it relates to Exeter and certainly involves Joseph Cilley as well. So those were two stories I wanted to highlight in terms of Cilley's role in them. And now I will talk a little bit about Henry Dearborn, and he certainly has a much more extensive history in terms of not only his career after the war, but also the record that he left behind. So Dearborn, again, you'll see his years up there that he was born, 1751 to 1829. And then we also have his years active with the New Hampshire Society, which is only through 1813. And this is because Dearborn then moves to Massachusetts and transfers his society membership to Massachusetts. So that line in the society is now represented today in the Massachusetts Society. So I'm going to talk about him, but we forgive him for moving from Massachusetts to Massachusetts. So I'll still talk about him and his role with the Society of the Cincinnati, and a couple other highlights from his life and his time as well. So Dearborn is actually born in Hampton, New Hampshire, and as I mentioned, lives out the later years of his life in Massachusetts. But he began his practice as a physician in Nottingham in 1772, and took special interest in military affairs and in studying the art of war. I think what's interesting is, even though he has this training as a physician, he really excels in battle and military. So he's not serving in the army as a physician or a doctor. He's really using his skills and his leadership skills in that way. And we were talking at the beginning of this lecture, this is the perfect day to be giving this talk, because today was the day that he got word of what had happened in Lexington and Concord on April 19th and decided to march with his men down to Concord to participate in what he needed to do. So he covered those 55 miles in a day. And it's immediately after that he becomes captain of the 1st New Hampshire. So by April 23rd, within 3 days, he's captain of the 1st New Hampshire. And in looking at his kind of military history, he really ends up at, I think, nearly every major battle of the Revolutionary War Dearborn is at. So he is also in Quebec with Benedict Arnold when they get captured. That is not a successful battle that they have. He is taken prisoner in 1775, in exchange in 1777, when he rejoins the army at that time, he joined Cilley's men and Cilley's group. So they're fighting together for part of the war. He's with the 3rd New Hampshire for Ticonderoga, Saratoga, Valley Forge. He's on the Clinton-Sullivan expedition with Cilley as well. He's in Yorktown. He's transferred to the 1st New Hampshire and serves through the end of the war until 1783 when he's discharged. So he had served with the 1st and the 3rd New Hampshire, and he's also quartermaster general to Washington during the war as well. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but his journals from the wartime survive, which are a great resource for us. After the war, he moves first to Maine and then to Massachusetts. Well, certainly Maine was part of Massachusetts then. And he's appointed U.S. Marshal for that district, and he's elected to Congress. But then President Jefferson appoints him Secretary of War in 1801, and he is the first New Hampshire man to hold a cabinet position in the United States. He held that position throughout Jefferson's presidency until 1809. He's then collector of the Port of Boston, and then he also serves in the War of 1812, after which he is then minister to Portugal under President Monroe, and settles towards the end of his life in Massachusetts. In terms of his work with the Society of the Cincinnati, he's the first vice president of the society from 1783 to 1784. And then, as I mentioned, he transfers his membership to the Massachusetts Society when he moves there in 1813, and that's where his line is now represented. And this was explained to me by one of the society members that if at those early years in the society's time, you could adjust your membership based on where you lived. So if you moved from New Hampshire to Pennsylvania, you could then become a member of the Pennsylvania Society. So there were some people that kind of moved around in those original days, but now membership is based on where your ancestors served. So that's why the Cilley descendants may not live in New Hampshire. They may live anywhere in the country, but it's based on the society that you belong to is based on where your ancestors served. So Dearborn kept journals during his time at war, with the exception of a kind of 6-month period in 1782. And the 6 parts that are published in the volume, and that you can find them in a number of places, and it is digitized online as well, is one of the very few kind of eyewitness accounts of the Revolutionary War, and complete eyewitness accounts, I would say. There are other journals and documents that survive. I know Daniel Gookin had some from the Sullivan-Clinton expedition, but all of kind of bits and pieces. Dearborn's is one of the most complete. And there are a few different lines I wanted to pull out that say a little bit more about him, because he really gives not just detail of where they were and what they did, but there's a lot more kind of colorful ideas that really give you an idea of what camp life was like or what they were doing. There's one line where he's talking about the battle in Quebec, and they can't tell from looking at how they're dressed what side people are on. So they keep seeing men and they're like, wait, what side are you on? So there's one part where he says, I was just about to hail them when one of them hailed me. He asked who I was. I answered, a friend. And he asked me who I was a friend to. And I answered, to liberty. And then he replied, God damn you. So that's how he knew he was the enemy, when that was the response he got in telling he was a friend to liberty. So idea to give you kind of what's happening on the battlefield. And then another line that made me chuckle out loud when I was reading it, as he's talking about camp life, and he's going through everything from the weather to what they're eating to what they're celebrating. He writes, I ate part of a fried rattlesnake today, which would have tasted very well had it not been a snake. So just all these little insights into what life was like on the camp. His first wife actually passes away while he's serving in the war. So there, he talks about going home and being with her on her deathbed and then having to return. So it's really powerful to read those stories. So I highly encourage folks to look into that if you're looking for kind of a deep dive into first-person accounts of the Revolutionary War. It's really interesting to read. And being from New Hampshire, I'm sure you will recognize a lot of the names that are in those journals as well. And I wanted to include here as well an original society medal. These are ones that were actually crafted, done on the lawn font design. The medal have kind of gone through different incarnations over time, but only 2 society members have the original lawn font eagle, which in the society world is a very big deal. It's, you know, the most original you can get. And Henry Dearborn is one of them, and Nicholas Gilman is the other. So another nice connection between our 2 organizations that way. However, as I was chatting with the gentleman who runs the membership of the society, we don't know where either of those medals are these days. We like to think they're somewhere with their families, but we do know that those 2 had original medals that were designed by Lawn Font. And then I also just wanted to give a quick overview of how Dearborn's legacy lives on in New Hampshire. So on the left-hand side, we have a reenactor group that's actually called Captain Dearborn's Company. And they come and participate at our festival, and they show what camp life is like, and also do some of the more domestic sides of camp life, which I think is really interesting. So there is this kind of living history side of Dearborn's legacy that lives on. And then of course we have Fort Dearborn, which is at the Seacoast Science Center in Dearborn State Park. That's named after our Dearborn as well. That's the old World War II fort that's there. So if you're going in the trails at Seacoast Science Center, you may see those bunkers in there. That's named for him. As I understand it, Dearborn's childhood home in Hampton is still standing as well. It's a private residence, but it's there. And also Fort Dearborn, there's another one that exists in Chicago, and that is essentially where downtown Chicago is now. And if you've ever been there, on Dearborn Street, there is a plaque that says this is where Fort Dearborn was. And that was the area where Fort Dearborn was, and that was named after Dearborn when he was Secretary of War under Monroe. So I think that's interesting that there's also this Chicago connection there, but his legacy still lives on in New Hampshire in various ways as well. So now I want to kind of tie it all together in a way that I didn't foresee until I was down in Concord yesterday for Patriots Day. And there was a whole exhibit on the Daniel Chester French Minuteman statue, which is pictured on the left here. And that statue was done by, as I said, Daniel Chester French, who's an Exeter born and raised. So again, a nice connection there. And he had this statue unveiled in 1874 to celebrate the Minuteman. And what you see, besides the musket he's carrying, is the plow next to him. And that plow, that symbol of the plow, comes directly from Cincinnatus. So again, in our Cincinnati print we saw earlier, you see the oxen and the plow that he's in the field. So it's that idea of this kind of civilian soldier as well. And I just think there are so many similarities between the Daniel Chester French statue of the Minuteman and your 4 Generals statue in Nottingham. So you can see the similarities in their poses. There's no plow in the Nottingham statue, but it is a very similarly posed individual. So just a kind of a nice connection to draw those 3 things together in terms of how the soldiers both envision themselves and how we still remember them today. So I'm going to kind of keep going a little bit and talk a little bit more about our museum before I conclude. And I want to kind of bring you up to speed with the modern era of the society. As I mentioned, they had purchased our Lad Gilman house in 1902 and have been active since they reformed in the 1890s. They purchased our Folsom Tavern in 1929. And really, after going through this kind of lull period across the societies in the 19th century, they're really revived by 1925 and are very active. So here we have a photo on the left-hand side of World War I servicemen who were also society members. And then when the society actually purchased Lad Gilman House and were calling for donations to it, since it served as their headquarters. For the society at large, there is a national headquarters down in Washington, D.C. at Anderson House. So they are, that started as their headquarters in 1938, and they're really focused on educational activities as they relate to the society as a whole. So the General Society has a headquarters, but then, as I mentioned, our New Hampshire Society is headquartered here at the Ladd Gilman House. The discovery of one of our highlights of our collection, our Dunlap broadside, leads to our museum opening to the public in 1991. And I will show you that document here. So on the left-hand side, we have the Dunlap broadside. This is a real kind of jewel of our collection. It's an original printing of the Declaration of Independence from the night of July 4th in 1776. That is the reason we have our festival in mid-July, is to celebrate that document's arrival in Exeter, in the capital. The man who lived in our house, John Taylor Gilman, read it to the public. We also have working drafts of the Constitution in our collection. We have letters from George Washington and a badge of military merit, which is the kind of precursor to what we know as the Purple Heart today. So again, a lot of things that still relate back to soldiers and the idea of service. The badge of military merit was created by Washington as a way to honor and decorate those men who had fought valiantly in service for the country. So here are my shameless plugs for the museum, and then I'll wrap up and take your questions. So again, we have our American Independence Festival we host in July, full of reenactors. The gentleman you see down in the bottom left is John Stark, a reenactor that portrays him. If anyone's ever willing to portray Cilley or Dearborn, let me know. We're always looking for more New Hampshire faces to add to our crowd. We also have a number of new digital resources that we've created as part of our response to COVID. A lot of our revolutionary story time and other programs, including our full virtual festival from last year, is all available on our website and on our YouTube channel. We also have a traveling trunk that goes into school free of charge and brings all these hands-on reproduction objects to students. It also goes to libraries during the summer. So if you know any educators, please let them know about this wonderful free resource that we have. And then I would encourage you all to join us by becoming a member, coming for a tour. We're always looking for more volunteers, docents, educators, public programs. There's a role for everyone at our organization. And also come visit us. This is our Folsom Tavern where we're doing our tours. These are our dates and hours that we're running them, at least to start and see how this season goes and where we are with the pandemic in a few months. And then I'd invite you to connect with us. So we're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Our website is there, independencemuseum.org. Lots of great events that we are doing coming up, both in person and virtually. And with that, I will gladly take any questions. And my contact info is also there, my email and my phone number. So if there are questions you think of after the fact, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know.
I don't see any, thank you very much. I don't see any questions. Jan wrote that Joseph Cilley's home is still standing in
Oh,
Nottingham.
fantastic. Great.
On Nottingham Square there. And I wish there was someone else here besides me from the Historical Society. Steve Welch, isn't Dearborn's house there as well? Yes. That's right
Yes,
on
all on the square, right?
right on the square there.
Great.
They all pretty much lived on the square, the four generals.
Yes.
Um,
Well, any other questions, comments?
we have that it was
Anyone want to try to stump me with their Revolutionary War knowledge? Anything like that?
Connie says, my husband is a direct descendant of Joseph Cilley. I nominate him to play General Cilley.
We'll take him. Sounds great.
Jan says, thank you very much. I found this very interesting. Another thank you. Is there anything you wanted to say, Steve Welch, about the 300th and our things in relation to these generals? Put up, I have him muted. I guess he can't. Do you want to speak, Steve, or no?
Sure, I can speak. It's great to have you on board with us tonight, Emma. Thank everybody for joining us. We look forward to having a great celebration, great reenactment, encampment in August of 2021.
22.
22, sorry. I don't know where my head's at. I think I'm starting to get Alzheimer's. But again, support our article at the town polls this year. Anybody gets a chance, I highly recommend going down to the American Independence Museum. Great resource. They have a great festival every July. Just great to see everybody here tonight. Hopefully it's viewed by many more in the coming weeks. So Emma, I really
I have a
appreciate all
couple
your
more
work.
questions. Don't go away yet, Emma.
Okay.
The first one you can answer. Can female descendants join the society now, or is it still male?
No, they cannot. It is still all male,
wow.
unfortunately. Yes, there is a kind of parallel organization. I want to say they're called the Daughters of the Cincinnati that does exist. But there are also other kind of female groups as well, both with the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Colonial Dames that you could look into.
Okay, and someone wanted to know, and you won't be able to answer this, Emma, and I'm not going to because I always get their houses mixed up. Someone wanted to know which house is which of the generals up on the square. Can you answer that, Steve Welch?
So naturally, the big farmhouse where Romeo is now was one of the taverns.
Right.
Joseph Cilley, well, the Cilley homes residence was over where the dairy farm is now, where Dave Fernald lives. And the other one was the other two houses over by the old schoolhouse.
Right.
So, I mean,
And
all of them are still standing. I don't think Joseph Cilley was in the farmhouse where the Fernalds are now. I think that was built much later.
yeah, that's not the original house, but I believe
Right.
that's where it was. And I think Dearborn was the house along those ones by the schoolhouse, the one closest to Route 156, I think
Right.
was Dearborn's.
I think you're right too.
Does it still have to be the oldest son to oldest son on the
That's a good
Cincinnati?
question. And no, it does not anymore. That was one of the rules they changed, I think, in the 1850s. I think it's called like the rule of 1852, because for just that reason, they were losing members very quickly. So they opened it up to be any son or kind of male relative. So it can be a cousin, it can be a nephew. And there are a few lines that kind of bounce around a little bit, like they kind of go all over the place. I had done a talk at the Franklin Pierce homestead, and his father was an original member. And so we had traced that line because Franklin didn't have any son that lived. So it went to his brother's line, and then it came back to his line through a daughter. So they usually will find a way, but no, it does not have to be through the oldest son anymore.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm a descendant of Joseph Cilley also, and never joined because it was always thought that it had to be oldest son to oldest son. And
yeah, not anymore. So if any of you are tangentially related, if any of you men are tangentially related, look into it, because you certainly could be eligible.
Somebody wanted to know if the museum is nonprofit.
Yes, we are. Yep. So the society is our parent organization, but we are a separate 501c3, the American Independence Museum. So they basically are an extra layer in our governance of the organization, but we're a separate independent nonprofit.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate you speaking to us tonight. And learned some new things tonight about Cilley and oops, and here comes another question. Do you have any of the original belongings of the generals from Nottingham at the museum?
I don't believe we do. I was actually looking to see what was in our collection related to them. And I think besides things that have their signatures on them, so like society archives that maybe were signed by Dearborn because he was treasurer, I don't believe we have anything that was owned by them. And I'm saying I don't believe so because I think what we also have are like pictures of things that they owned. I believe like Cilley's sword. I believe we have a photo of that, but I don't believe we have the actual sword. So we have some it's kind of related things like that. But no, nothing that I can think of that was owned by any of them.
Right. We still have the sword, but I don't think it was of Joseph. Well, it was probably of Joseph, but not General Joseph. I think it was Joseph of the War of 1812.
Oh, maybe. I thought it was General Joseph. I'll have to look at that again. And
It's very confusing because there were so many
all
Joseph
have the same
Cilleys.
name. I know. We
Insane.
find that with our Gilmans too. They all seem to be named Nicholas or Daniel,
Right.
or Nathaniel. They're not very original with their names. I'll have to look at that. Yeah, because I do remember, and I thought it was just a photo of the swords that we had, but I'll have to look at that. So no, I believe we do not have anything that was originally owned by them.
Right. I know Cilley's original pistols are housed at the New Hampshire Heritage Museum in Concord.
Yes, there are a lot of things that ended up at New Hampshire Historical Society. And I specifically think a number of Cilley's things, if I'm not mistaken, ended up there. And I'm trying to think where else have been repositories for them. I'll have to think more about that, but I do know a number of Cilley's things are at New Hampshire Historical Society.
Okay, any more questions? I guess I should have asked, or comments. Well, I'll say it again, but yes, thank you very much, Emma. We appreciated you talking, and those of you who know people who might have enjoyed this talk, they will be available through the town's YouTube channel, and I will put that up as soon as it gets edited, and I'll put the information out there. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you at other 300th events as it comes up. And once again, if you want to help out, please get in touch with us. Nottingham 300th at gmail.com. Is that correct, Steve?
That is correct.
All right.
And we need all the help we can get. So
Yes.
please spread the word. Emma, as time goes on, maybe we can get you to do another program for us.
Happy to do that.
So great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to see you all this evening. So thank you again.
Okay. Look forward to talking to you in the near future.
All right.
Okay. Good night.
Night all.
Bye-bye.